It was a rainy evening in Denver, Colorado, when I got the last order of the night. My shift as a delivery driver for Taste of Denver was almost over, and I was ready to head home. The cold air came in through the broken window of my old car as I drove toward a residential area I had never seen before. My boss, Matt, had given me the paper with the address and phone number, 2 pizzas and a bottle of beer, destination Cypress Lane. I had never noticed this place before, but when I saw the address, I thought it would be a quick delivery. Back in 2015, I didn't have a smartphone with GPS, just an old map and a car that was beginning to show signs of wear. The road that led me further and further away from the city seemed deserted, shrouded in fog and the dim lights of street lamps. Every so often, stories I had heard about isolated areas and strange people came to mind, but I tried not to think about it too much. This area didn't seem dangerous, but something made me uneasy. Cypress Lane wasn't like the other residential neighborhoods. When I finally arrived, the road ended in a dead end. The houses were far apart, hidden behind tall trees and bushes that seemed to take over. The house at the end of the street looked out of place, old, with an unkempt garden and a front door that seemed like it hadn't been opened in years. An absolute silence surrounded me. I parked in front of the house, trying not to think about how out of place it seemed in this area. I grabbed the pizzas and walked up to the door, not knowing what to expect. I rang the doorbell. Nothing. I knocked insistently. A few minutes passed, and I began to think no one was home when finally I heard footsteps inside. The door opened slowly, revealing a tall man with gray hair and an impassive expression. He looked at me without saying a word. Only after a moment did he speak. "Pizza," he said in a low voice, almost a murmur. "Yes, pizza for Mr. Harris," I replied, trying to stay polite. He motioned for me to come inside without smiling, and I hesitated. I didn't know why, but there was something off. I stepped inside, but as soon as I did, I realized something was wrong. The house was incredibly dark, with only a faint light coming from a lamp barely illuminating the living room. The furniture was old, covered in dust, and the air smelled damp, as if the house hadn't been aired out in weeks. "Can I put the pizza here?" I asked, pointing to the table, trying not to look too out of place. "Sure," he replied, but his voice was strangely monotone. He stared at me again, like I was an oddity. I set the pizzas on the table and, without realizing it, he had already disappeared into another room. The silence that filled the house was awkward. I looked around, noticing old photographs on the walls, black and white ones of children and couples. But what really caught my attention were the faces in the photos. Their eyes seemed hollow, emotionless. The feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. At that moment, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and the man had returned. With a gentle gesture, he motioned for me to follow him. "I'll show you where to get the money for the pizza," he said, but his voice was even softer, almost a whisper. I followed him down the hallway, but the further we went into the house, the more strange the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to bend, as if the house was older than I had thought. With every step on the floor, I heard it creak, and the sound echoed ominously. Finally, we reached a room that seemed like an office. But what I saw inside froze me. It wasn't a normal room. Shelves lined with books were everywhere, but the walls were covered with dozens of clocks, each one frozen at a different time. A large wall clock ticked oddly, the hands motionless. There was something unsettling about the place. "Do you like clocks?" he asked, as if it were a casual question. But I didn't know how to respond. The air in the room felt thicker. I grew more uncomfortable when I saw another man standing at the back of the room. He was standing still, looking at me without saying a word. His gaze was intense, like he was studying me. I felt like an intruder in a house that didn't belong to me. My heart began to race. "Can I have the money?" I finally asked, breaking the silence, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he started to laugh, a deep laugh, but so soft that it seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. Then he called out, "Randall," in a voice that was suddenly much louder and commanding. I had reached my limit. I turned around and started heading back to the front door. As I glanced down the hallway, about to step outside, I saw the man who had been standing in the back of the room now simply standing there, staring at me. I rushed out of the house, closing the door behind me. I ran to my car, still holding the pizzas for some reason. I threw them on the passenger seat and got in as quickly as I could. As I backed out to make a three-point turn, I looked back at the house. The door was fully open again. My heart raced as I imagined one of them was standing outside my car, about to open one of the doors. Maybe they were, and I'll never know, but I managed to drive down that dirt road and back onto the main road. I had to return to the pizzeria. I called Matt to let him know what happened. He wasn't mad at me. When I got back, everyone laughed when I told them the story. I can see how it sounds funny when explained to others, but it wasn't funny at the time. Whatever was going on in that house wasn't normal, and I don't think they ever intended to buy pizza. I've had several dreams since then where I see the man's face peeking from behind a wall. After that, I never entered anyone's house or apartment for deliveries again. It was a late September evening, cool and rainy. Fall was starting to make its presence felt, and the city seemed quieter than usual. My shift as a delivery guy for a local pizzeria had just started. I wasn't a rookie, I had been working for about 2 years, but there were nights when I felt that something strange was about to happen. Tonight, it seemed like my fate was about to play a nasty trick on me. My shift was from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., and that night, as usual, the city was semi-deserted. There weren't many customers at this hour, so I thought it would be a quiet evening. But soon, a notification popped up on my phone. An order, a delivery. The address that appeared on the screen was unfamiliar to me. It was a residential area a bit far from downtown, near a more isolated neighborhood, and there wasn't even a pizzeria nearby. Strange, but I didn't think much about it. I accepted the delivery and left. The rain was heavy, and the streets were slippery. Every puddle reflected the streetlights, creating optical illusions as I rode. But despite the pouring rain and traffic, I still felt comfortable on my motorcycle. The pizzeria was not far, but this order seemed to take me to an area I didn't know well. I had a feeling that something wasn't right, but I tried to shake it off. I was already on the road. I arrived in an area that looked abandoned. The houses were large, but some seemed old and neglected. The neighborhood didn't seem dangerous or peaceful, but rather a bit forgotten. There was a large villa at the end of the street, surrounded by a rusty gate, which sent a chill down my spine as soon as I saw it. I stopped in front of the house indicated on the order, parking the bike on the sidewalk. The dim light from a lamp by the entrance barely illuminated the doorstep, but I couldn't see much further. The sound of the rain hitting the street was the only noise accompanying my heavy breathing. I got off the bike with the pizza under my arm. The main door of the house was completely dark. I knocked once, but no one answered. I decided to wait a few minutes, but after a while, frustration began to rise. I knocked again, this time louder. Still nothing. I looked around, hearing the wind blowing through the trees. The house was isolated, and there were no other buildings nearby. I started to feel scared that I was alone, in the middle of the night, in a place that seemed like it had come out of a horror movie. I decided to call the number on the receipt. The phone rang several times, but no one answered. I started to think it was a prank, but something told me I should wait a bit longer. I didn't want to go back to the pizzeria with an undelivered order. But as I waited, I started hearing a noise behind me, like rustling. I turned abruptly, but there was no one. However, the feeling of being watched immediately overwhelmed me. I looked beyond the gate, toward a garden that seemed hidden. It seemed like someone was behind the plants. I sighed, trying to keep calm. I had no choice but to keep knocking. Another knock, louder. But the silence was broken by a movement behind the window of the house. A figure appeared, peering from behind the curtains. I couldn't make out the features of their face, but I knew they were watching me. My heart raced, and that feeling of fear intensified. Who was that person? And why were they watching me like that? Suddenly, the door opened abruptly. A tall man with a strange expression appeared before me. He looked disheveled, as if he hadn't been out in weeks. He wore an old leather jacket and had a look that immediately made me feel uneasy. "Who are you?" he asked, but didn't seem surprised to see me. He responded as if he had already known I was coming. "The pizza," I said, trying to stay as calm as possible. The man stepped back and let me in without saying a word. The house was dark, with only a dim light coming from a room further inside. I could smell stale food in the air. I couldn't see much, but I could tell that this house didn't seem normal. It was as if it had been abandoned halfway, with dusty rooms and objects scattered everywhere. "Your order is ready," the man said in a monotone voice, but didn't move to take it. My mind began racing with questions. "What do you mean by ready?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He seemed like he was in a trance, more concerned about other things than what I was doing. At that point, my instincts were screaming at me to leave, but the door behind me slammed shut with a sharp sound. I didn't know what to do. I turned to look at the man again, but he didn't seem threatening, at least at first. He approached slowly and handed me the payment, but his gaze never left me. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't decipher. "Are you here by accident?" he asked, but his voice was low, almost menacing. I replied yes, trying to appear calm, but I didn't even believe it myself. When I tried to take a step back to leave, he blocked my path. "You didn't just come for a pizza," he said in a low voice. That sentence froze the blood in my veins. I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't want to find out. I decided I needed to leave immediately. Without saying a word, I turned to go back to the door, but he grabbed my arm with a firm grip. Fear consumed me completely. "Let me go," I said, trying not to show how terrified I was. His gaze was fixed on me, and for a moment, I thought I might never leave that house alive. But just then, the door opened, and another person appeared in the doorway. A man who looked more normal, but with a strange expression. He gestured for me to leave. In that precise moment, I broke free from the man's grip and ran out of the house. I didn't look back. I quickly got on my bike and sped away, my heart pounding. Once I returned to the pizzeria, I tried to calm down. But I couldn't stop thinking about that house, those people, and what I had faced. I would never make a delivery to that area again. The city had never seemed so dark, so threatening. I never told anyone what happened that night. And to this day, every time I go out for a delivery, that strange feeling of being watched never leaves me. The fear that that night might just be the beginning of something much bigger. I worked as a rider for a food delivery platform. My financial situation wasn't great, so to get by, I took on any job I could, even if it was deep into the night and the only traffic I encountered were the flickering lights of deserted houses. I mostly worked late at night because, at that hour, the tips were better, and there was less traffic. That evening, I was in the center of a provincial town. The call had taken me to a residential area, far from the livelier part of the city, in the outskirts. It was around 12:30 a.m. when I accepted a delivery from a fast food place. The address seemed odd to me. It was in an area I didn't frequent often, but I didn't think much of it. The platform said the destination was about 15 minutes away. As I headed toward the address, the landscape changed rapidly. I left behind the streets lit by streetlights and entered a dark area, with few buildings and many isolated houses. There were no other cars in sight, and the atmosphere became more and more eerie. The road seemed endless, with forests on both sides closing in, and the air was thick and silent. I kept driving, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The address was taking me to a dead-end road. I finally arrived at the destination and parked the car in front of an isolated house at the end of the street. All the lights were off, and the house seemed abandoned. Outside the gate, there were no signs of life. The sound of my car engine was the only noise breaking the silence. I decided to ring the doorbell, but there was no answer. I knocked insistently on the door, hoping someone would respond, but nothing. I began to think I had the wrong address, but then the customer replied to my message and confirmed I was in the right place. He told me to leave the food at the door, but for some reason, I felt that something was off. There wasn't even a car parked outside, as if no one lived in that house. Despite it being past midnight, I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. The street was dark, no lights, no sounds. I decided to wait a little longer to see if anyone showed up, but nothing. My heart was pounding harder, and my mind kept trying to figure out what was going on. When I asked the customer again to confirm the address, he responded vaguely, saying, "I'm inside, but wait a second." That didn't sound like a convincing answer. While I was standing there, trying to gather my thoughts, something caught my attention. A low, deep voice came from the shadows. "Hey, you're here," someone said. Instinctively, I looked around, but there was no one. I jumped, but tried to stay calm. The voice repeated, "Leave the food here." I walked closer to the door and placed the package, trying to not make it seem suspicious. The voice became more insistent, but I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I was getting more and more nervous when I heard a noise behind me. I turned around quickly and saw, in the shadow and little light, figures moving stealthily. At that point, I started to feel like something was really wrong. Suddenly, I noticed a figure approaching slowly, with heavy footsteps. My breath became more erratic. I couldn't see clearly who it was, but the figure kept getting closer and closer until it stopped right next to me. It was a tall person, dressed in black, with a hood covering their face. Without a word, the figure stepped back, and another man appeared behind me, scaring me even more. At that moment, I realized I was about to be surrounded. I quickly turned toward my car and tried to go back, but when I looked at my phone, I noticed I was getting messages. The customer had written, "Come here, it's all good." But I couldn't help thinking it was all a trap. I started the car engine and tried to escape, but when I realized one of the tires was completely flat, I understood they had slashed my tires. My heart was racing, panic was rising inside me. I tried to restart the car, but the headlight was dim, and as soon as I rolled down the window to get a better look, I heard that voice again, this time closer. "Don't run away, friend," said one of the men. I began to tremble, and in that exact moment, I saw them. 2 more men were approaching, also dressed in black, with their faces covered by masks. The blood froze in my veins. I realized they were setting a trap for me. I tried to stay calm and not make any rash moves. But it was useless. One of them approached the door of my car, opened it violently, and pulled me out without saying a word. "Give us everything," he yelled. I tried not to give in right away, but the other 2 came closer menacingly. I couldn't take any chances, so trembling, I handed them everything I had: my phone, my wallet, my bag, even my smartwatch. They stripped me in an instant and left me there, on the ground, as they disappeared into the darkness. I slowly got up, but I couldn't see anything around me. I was shaking, fear had paralyzed me. I felt a sharp pain, but I didn't have the strength to call for help. After a while, I managed to walk to the nearest house. I rang the doorbell, and a woman opened the door. I quickly told her my story, and fortunately, she let me use her phone to call the police and ask for assistance. Shortly after, the authorities arrived, but there wasn't much to be done. The thieves were already far away, and my car was unusable. The customer turned out to be part of a well-planned scam, an operation to rob me. I had lost everything, the money, my personal belongings, but the lesson I learned was priceless. I would never ignore my instincts again, and from that moment on, all my late-night deliveries became just a bad memory. I decided to take a break for a while, reflecting on how naive I had been. Fear stayed with me for days, and I never went back to making deliveries at night. The road home that night seemed longer than any other trip.